Hey guys, how's it going? I'm here for recording my next assignment, which is on talking about narrative in video games. As a side note thing, though, apparently, I guess at least one of you noticed my girlfriend Lee in the background last time. Uh, she's there again, so wave hi. But yeah, so anyways, my assignment is to basically talk about how narrative has evolved since video game. I'm gonna move this down just a little bit, just to kind of get the framing down better. Really, just to talk about uh, narrative and how it's kind of evolved and what it means throughout video games. Something I'm very partial toward because I love stories. I love a good story when it comes to video games. So this is on definitely right up my alley. And I got assigned to read Chapter 5 of the Medium of the video game, which is essentially what Mark was talking about in that. And uh, so I'm just gonna give a basic kind of breakdown thing of how like video games were originally were just things like Pong or like stuff like Pong, where it was basically just like blocks and dots and stuff moving around. They were like blocky. They started off as blocky human figures that were just more or less interactive stick figures, essentially, is what it's essentially boiling it down to. Where, and really the only big things that usually were around that time or so that the big things that like did have like a lot of character development and stuff in it were essentially text adventure games, which were basically just interactive books, essentially. It didn't really start getting that way until, like, I guess, from what it seemed like, at least how the book was breaking it down, was that they didn't really start to get an identity until stuff like Pac-Man and Mario and, like, Hubert started coming out, where not only did they have, like, defining characteristics and essentially personalities in the games, but they also were able to exist outside of video games, like Pac-Mania during the '80s, where Pac-Man was everywhere on like toys, clothing, board games. Same thing too happened with a lot of the Nintendo games like Mario and Legend of Zelda and all that type of things. Uh, he then kind of went on to start talking about the different. Uh, apologies, I'm recovering from a cold. Uh, where they started to talk about how there were differences between like player characters in a game, and then there was everything else that were like the computer controlled incidental characters, which could take anything from the form of helpers, hinderers, beneficiaries, neutral characters, and then narrators, which I probably don't need to explain what those are. They're more or less pretty self-explanatory in their naming structure. Yeah, and then narrative also, from what he also talked about that, which is I think essential in a narrative because there's always the protagonist. There's always like the protagonist and the antagonist kind of type structure, and then there's like the side characters in between that fill different various roles. From there, he went on to talk about how he also brought up the Ultima series quite a bit in terms of trying to revolutionize how storytelling was in like early on with the first Ultima game, and how it like had this big expansive world that you could experience essentially, which I've actually never played any of the Ultima games, which might be something I should probably get around to at some point. But yeah. He also goes on to talk about how first-person views were first developed with something like Battlezone, in addition to with Battlezone, and that it was like through the player's eyes to try and create a more immersive experience. And then stuff like moving views, where like the camera actually moved with you in a certain way. And the examples that Tomb Raider was an example that he brought with that. And they also talked about interactive movies, which were, well, those are pretty easy. They're basically like FMV games. He kept using the Star Trek the Star Trek Borg video game quite a bit in the example, which I've never played, but it definitely sounds like interesting in the way it's set up. From there, he moved on to talking about extra-diegetic narration, where video games and storylines went from essentially being something that was just listed down in the instruction manual as to what was going on in the story to having it be in-game scenes where there's dialogue, where there's certain movie scenes with dialogue and characters and talking about what's going on, to like seamless integration where there's dialogue in gameplay as well as also telling a story like through gameplay in addition to just not just having cutscenes. Seamless integration. From there he moved on to talking about like the narrational orientation and structure, which, like, the views, goals of characters, what they have to go through to get them, motivations for really all the characters within it trying to achieve their own views and goals. Interactivity and narrative. The examples they used there were Mist and Gadget, which involved you having to check notes, to be able to solve certain puzzles, things like that. And then also talking about how games eventually started to establish specific rules for going through narrative structure and development, and kind of having a sort of a kill or be killed kind of idea, to where there was basically giving the players a reason to try and survive and do better in a game, to essentially not have the negative failure to coincide with my other with the recent theme that I've had with my past two assignments, to kind of not have that happen in a way for the characters. It's more or less kind of a Cliff Notes version of what the article actually talked about, or I keep saying article, what it talked about, and I'm also supposed to decide if I can really argue against it, and I can't. Well, I mean, it does kind of go all over the place a little bit in terms of what it's actually talking about. It jumps around time periods a bit, but really that's, I think, a pretty good idea of how really gaming structure is developed. I mean, games started off as just being Pong is one of the first video games ever developed, and essentially the story there is that there's two dots and two paddles moving around, and then it went on from there to essentially having nowadays where we're getting games like The Last of Us that are essentially it's essentially a movie unto itself, really, with the cinematic structure that it has and things like that, where it's just sweeping in how amazing its story is told. So really, I pretty much agree with him. It's a pretty solid argument for how narrative has developed as a whole since then. And then I was also supposed to keep in mind the other article that was about talking about how plot is, just kind of an aside with that, how the plot is overrated and game narrative is really all about your characters. I both agree and disagree with that at the same time, and really I think it goes about it. It honestly goes about in how it's executed. For example, going back to an example that he used was going back to Last of Us. That's where I got the idea from. Was really that The Last of Us, the story is essentially the plot of Last of Us is essentially get this girl from point A to point B, and that's really all there is to the plot, the actual main plot of the story. But what makes it interesting is really the interactions between Joel and Ellie as they go across, which it really makes that story all that really makes the story itself really all that more interesting because they're both such interesting and well developed and just like really good characters overall. And so whereas like so it's really kind of like it rises above like the character development kind of rises above the more simplistic plot to really I can think elevate the source material. Now that being said, there are times where it is a good idea to have a good story behind it, to have like a really good story to be able to support the characters. And an example of that would be, as I've used it before, Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 2 has a pretty decent story that's out that's yeah, it has it kind of starts off basic but starts getting more twists and turns as it goes through and is also supported by a very large cast of very well developed, very interesting characters that you really care about. I guess really to break it down is that if when it comes down to it, you can have a really good plot, but it really doesn't matter what's going on in the story if you don't care about the people involved. So characters are important, but they're just as important as the plot, if that really makes any sense. That's just kind of an aside. I realize that turned into like a 2 to 3 minute aside here, but then again, that's me. So, anyways, that's really what I've got for this week. So, anyways, I'll see you guys next week. Bye.